enlightened rulers, change in the way of thinking, and critical criticism all are aspects of the Enlightenment. So today we're going to discuss the Enlightenment and what it is. We've covered Frederick the Great, and we've covered other significant rulers and events from the Enlightenment period, but we have yet to delve into what it really was. I'm Shieldbro6 for the History Armada, and today we are discussing the Enlightenment. We are going to give you a brief overview of when it was, what it was, and who it affected and why. We're going to delve into all of the important aspects as we address this very important time period. The Enlightenment has been defined in many different ways, but at its broadest, it was a philosophical, intellectual, and cultural movement of the 17th and 18th centuries. It stressed reason, logic, criticism, and freedom of thought over dogma, blind faith, or superstition, which at the time was groundbreaking. And these cultural movements are still very important to our societies and how they exist today. Logic wasn't a necessary new invention by any means, having been used by people such as far back as the ancient Greeks, but it was now included in a worldview which argued that empirical observation and the examination of human life could reveal the truth behind human society and self as a concept. All were deemed to be rational and understandable. They were no longer just because I said so. They were no longer because God made him the ruler. No, now there was this rationale and this analysis going on of how things were taking place. The Enlightenment held that there could be a science of man. There's a reason to why we behave, as well as that the history of mankind was one of progress, which could be continued with the right thinking rather than blind trust. Consequently, the Enlightenment itself also argued that human life and character could be improved through uses such as education, reason, and expression. Rather than just being considered a function, that the universe was set, that we can't grow past what we are. It was this analysis and decision that perhaps there was a mechanical aspect to the universe that could be altered and expanded upon. These thinkers have even been described as intellectual, quote, terrorists, because they fought against the norm and they used shock media, essentially, with their writings to get their point across. They challenged religion with scientific method. They also instead favored, deism. Instead of favoring this deism, they favored thought. They favored free expression. We should be able to talk about the monarch how we want to speak. I mean, that's kind of a French and English example of, freedom of speech against that monarch, but it was this Enlightenment period and these Enlightenment thinkers that wanted to do more than just understand. They wanted to change as well as believe that they could be better and that the people of the world could be better. They thought reason and science could improve lives, which I have to agree. So, when was the Enlightenment? Well, there's no definitive starting or end point for the Enlightenment period, which leads many works to simply say it was the 17th and 18th century. It was a phenomenon within those centuries. But certainly the key era was the second half of the 17th century and almost the entirety of the 18th. When historians give dates, they often quote events such as the English Civil Wars, the revolutions such as the American Revolution against the English crown, the French Revolution, and they also are influenced by people such as Thomas Hobbes and one of the Enlightenment's and in Europe's most key political works, the Leviathan. Hobbes felt that the old political system had contributed to these bloody civil wars and searched for a new one based on the rationality of scientific inquiry. The end is usually given as either the death of Voltaire at the end of the Enlightenment or the start of the French Revolution, because those kind of marked the end of this progress with the groundwork being set. This is often claimed to have marked the downfall of the Enlightenment, as attempts to rework Europe into a more logical and egalitarian system collapsed into bloodshed, which killed many of the leading writers within France and other countries. It's possible to say that we are still in the Enlightenment, and we are still benefiting from their developments, but we are definitely in a post-Enlightenment age. Though there are no set dates, and they do not in themselves, have a value of judgment or a set value to them, I would say definitely the late 17th century and the early, the entirety of the 18th. But the late 1700s and possibly the early 1800s are probably the most significant for the changes within European and Western society. So there are variations and self-consciousness. One problem in defining the Enlightenment and what it was is that there was a great deal of divergence in the leading thinkers' views. They often argued against each other or even countered each other's works. And it is important to recognize that they argued and debated with each other over the correct ways to think and proceed. They weren't saying the other one was necessarily dumb or that their ideas were incorrect, but rather how they were going about the way of thinking was incorrect. Enlightenment views also varied geographically, with thinkers in different countries going in slightly different ways about the way of progress. For instance, the search for a science of man led some thinkers to search for the physiology of a body without a soul, while others searched for answers to how humanity gained thought. Still, there were others who tried to map humanity's development from a primitive state to now, and others still looked at the economics and politics behind social interaction within society. So, I think it's what is important to remember about the Enlightenment is this is where we saw a criticism of basically all aspects of human society. Religion, development, science, and politics and economics were all cast into the light. They were all brought forward in this kind of argument. But the Enlightenment actually called their era one of enlightenment. Okay, so the Enlightenment thinkers understood what they were doing, but there was no set title. But at the same time, did they call it an era of one of enlightenment? It's something that titles aren't necessary. I mean, whether or not they themselves called it an era of enlightenment or the Enlightenment period, it doesn't matter. What matters is the key processes and criticisms that they brought forward. So that brings us to who was considered enlightened. Who were the enlightened? Well, the spearhead of the Enlightenment was a body of well-connected writers and thinkers from across Europe and North America who became known as the philosophers, which is the French word for philosophers. These leading thinkers formulated, spread, and debated the Enlightenment into works. So they debated and put their thoughts together and against each other, and the most arguably dominant text of the period is the Encyclopedia, where historians once believed that the philosophers were the sole carriers of the Enlightenment thought. They now generally accept that they were merely the vocal tip of a much widespread intellectual awakening among the middle and upper classes, turning them into a new social force. All the educated. I mean, if you've seen or read the story of Les Mis, or you've seen the movie, the musical, these are college-age students understanding that there's something wrong with society in the early 1800s and deciding to do something about it. So we saw that middle and upper class with this new awakening pushing their thoughts and ideas forward. These were professionals such as lawyers, college students, administrators, office holders, clergy, even aristocrats, and they were reading many volumes of Enlightenment writing and soaking up their thinking and pushing it forward with their status. That's how we got these who are considered enlightened rulers. The rulers who observed and absorbed these enlightened thoughts and used them in their way of governing. So the origins of the Enlightenment and these enlightened thoughts that would be absorbed was the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which shattered old systems of thinking and allowed for new ones to emerge. The teachings of the Church and Bible, as well as works of classical antiquity so beloved of the Renaissance, were suddenly found lacking in scientific development or basis. It became both necessary and possible for philosophers to begin applying the new scientific method, where empirical observation was first applied to the physical universe, to the study of humanity and thought itself to create the science of man. So, it was not a total break, of course, from the Enlightenment, from the Renaissance, humanists, and such, And there's a lot of mixing between the two and overarching Christian myths that were still held highly, etc. But you have to understand that it was highly controversial conclusion, highly controversial. And the idea that they could push forward like this and divert humanity from Christianity and the Renaissance is one of the most important part of the scientific revolution that led to the Enlightenment. And then, of course, there was the politics and religion side of the Enlightenment. In general, Enlightenment thinkers argued for freedom of thought, religion, and politics. These philosophes were largely critical of Europe's absolutist rulers, so especially the French government, pictured here with the French Revolution. But there was little consistency. For instance, Voltaire, the critic of the French crown, spent some time at the court of Frederick II of Prussia, who we talked about in an earlier video, while Diderot traveled to Russia to work with Catherine the Great. Both left disillusioned. So although they saw different types of crowns and different types of governing styles, they both left upset and disillusioned. Rousseau had attracted criticism, especially since World War II, for appearing to call for an authoritarian rule. On the other hand, liberty was widespread and espoused by the enlightened thinkers, who were also largely against nationalism, and more in favor of international and cosmopolitan thinking. So you can kind of see on one hand how this diversion from politics and religions with the philosophes was kind of the opening grounds for the socialist thinkings and communist thinkings, as they were against the authoritarian, they were against the nationalism, and they were more in favor of a cosmopolitan and international speaking, which is why we see the French Commune rise to power several times. The philosophes were deeply critical, indeed even openly hostile to the organized religions of Europe, especially the Catholic Church, whose priests, popes, and practices came into quite severe criticism during the Enlightenment. The philosophes were not, with perhaps exceptions like Voltaire at the end of his life, atheists. Many of them were Christian, or at least a form of Christian, but they still believed in a God behind this new mechanism of the universe. Although they thought humanity could be improved, and there was always a cause and change within the mechanist universe, they believed there was still a God behind it. And few enlightened thinkers actually attacked personal piety, and many believed religion performed useful services when done right, or when paired with critical thinking. They were like, yes, religion and its morals could be very good for society and humanity as long as it is paired with critical thinking and enlightened thinking. Which led us to the effects of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment affected many areas of human existence, including politics, and perhaps the most famous examples of the latter are the US Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, and the idea of citizenship and independence, and of course freedom of speech and expression. Parts of the French Revolution are often attributed to the Enlightenment, either as recognition or as a way to attack the philosophes by pointing to violence such as the Terror as something that they unwillingly and unwittingly unleashed. There is also debate about whether the Enlightenment actually transformed popular society to match it, or whether it was itself transformed by high society. The Enlightenment era was a general turn away from the dominance of the church and the supernatural, with a reduction in belief of the cult, literal interpretations of the Bible, and the emergence of a largely secular public culture, and a secular intelligentsia, or the ability to challenge the previously dominant clergy. So we see the effects of the Enlightenment, which again, reminder, the Enlightenment era, the main causes were freedom of expression, freedom of thought, move away from politics, and move away from religion. So this Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries was followed by that of a reaction, Romanticism, a turn back to the emotional instead of the rational. You could call it a counter-Enlightenment, just like we saw a counter-Reformation. For a while, in the 19th century, it was common for the Enlightenment to be attacked as the liberal work of utopian fantasists, with critics pointing out there was plenty of good thinking and things about humanity not based on reason. Enlightenment thought was also attacked for not criticizing the emergence of capitalist systems. There is now a growing trend to argue that the results of the Enlightenment are still with us in science, politics, and increasingly in Western views of religion. and that we are still in an Enlightenment period, or heavily influenced by that Enlightenment period. More of the effects of the Enlightenment: there has been a lean away from the calling anything progress when it comes to history, but you'll find that the Enlightenment easily attacks and attracts people willing to call it a great step forward. So we see, of course, the emergence of things like independence, freedom of thought, and that's really the big thing that I keep hitting home here. The idea of Enlightenment was progress. This era of progress was the Enlightenment era. It stressed reason, logic, criticism, and the freedom of thought. Those are the 4 main points I want you to walk away with when you ask, or when you can answer, what is the Enlightenment? So that brings us to the end of today's video. I know it was a little all over the place as we covered a very broad subject of the Enlightenment period and its effects and what it was, but I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy today's video, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button for me. If you have any comments, suggestions, concerns, or I got something wrong, leave that in the comment section down below for me. I do read all of your comments. Furthermore, if you want to support me even further, check out the links in the description of the video. But that's it for me today. And as always, I am Shieldbro6 for the Gaming and the History Armada, and I'll catch y'all next time. Thank you so much for watching.